These lectures are built around the idea of a Lassallean heritage, not a Lassallean tradition. Very important distinction. It takes many traditions to make up a heritage. Heritage is something we inherit. It's also something which has a value to it, and it's something which we re-implement and reinvent again and again because it draws from some basic principle. Whereas a tradition has the difficulty sometimes of becoming just hidebound. I often use the example of myself in England when I was studying, and I was at the community in Blackheath. It's a very famous rugby school. And I am a referee of rugby. And I know the 84 conditions under which you give a penalty. It's not bad, is it? Not everybody can do that. And I was used to refereeing in Australia, where when you're going to call, before the match begins, you, clad splendidly, with your boots shining, your socks at the right angle, your blue jumper, your certificate proving you are a rugby referee, go to the centre of the field, and when you think you're ready, you blow the whistle ever so lightly, and the teams come on. And they line up. They're all also impeccably clad. You're as close to God as ever you will be. So that when the brothers at Blackheath said, do you happen to... I said, yes, I'm a rugby referee. Oh, good. Will you referee a match for us on Saturday? Certainly, I said. And I turned up at the field, according to all the protocol which I'd learnt in Australia to get my certificate. And I saw some kids sort of in odd socks and dirty boots kicking a soccer football around a field. And I couldn't see the rugby teams at all. I scanned the horizon like this. Eventually I blew a whistle and all these nondescript kids came on the field like that. That would never happen in Australia. We have preserved the tradition. But you see, in the country of its origin, the thing moved on. It was less starchy. And this is a very important point, so that you can have many different traditions, but be careful when they become hidebound. So we're going to talk about a heritage of which we are heirs. We're going to go right back to the beginnings to try and see what are the values that are being carried through. Not to preserve some of the things they did then, because de La Salle begins, after all, with grade school kids, whom he has for probably less than 2 years. So, as we go along, please feel free to interrupt at any stage, okay? You are going to get these wonderfully produced. You'll get the full texts, footnoted, and everything else of everything that's here. And I will present, but I won't present to the text. I'll present the lines of the text, not all the detail. Okay? So we're going to talk about the heritage in its origins. Back in the 1680s. Well before, you see. So John Baptist de La Salle goes to Paris, to Saint-Sulpice, to study. You'll find this text, etc. And one of the things you would have to do on Sunday afternoons was teach catechism, because he's working in Saint-Sulpice. Those of you who know Saint-Sulpice, even if you know it was there long before Dan Brown discovered it, it was the overflow. It was the Paris overflow. It was the left bank. Saint-Sulpice was on the edge of the countryside, and the poor overflowed the city, and Saint-Sulpice became this great agglomerate, a church with 12 different catechetical centres, thousands of kids, all poor, and so on like that. So he then had to take part in that. What did he know about teaching poor boys and girls? Probably not very much. What did he feel like at 17 years of age, going off with somebody probably a year or two older and being said, righto, these 12 boys, these are your class. They're all perhaps in a church or some kind of centre. Perhaps there are 12 here, there's another 12 over here with somebody else. Perhaps you're in a church with the girls on one side and the boys on the other. Perhaps there are 12 different classes all going on at the same time. The churches are very dark. They don't have books. You, of course, as beautiful teachers, you could get on without any of those things. But what about a 17-year-old and so on? I think it must have been a fairly scarifying experience. Anyhow, but we know he did it. We know he survived it. Was this the first time he met the real poor? because they certainly were poor in Saint Sulpice. What did he learn from that? I think he learned a great deal. Because this is Jean-Jacques Ollier, the great founder of the Sulpicians, and he had written, "God wants me to aid the young by sharing Christian principles with them and indicating the fundamental maxims of salvation." Oh, this is a key word for us, this word salvation. "This by means of the young clerics from the seminary who will go out to bring instruction," always means religious instruction, "to the remoter neighbourhoods. Out in the various sections of the parish there are 12 instruction classes, each attended by 2 priests or seminarians, of which one had the special charge of assembling the children by going through the streets with a bell." We also know that going streets with a bell sometimes calling the children together was Sunday afternoon. Now there's no football or telly to watch, but sometimes the children responded by pelting the person who actually carried the bell. Did he experience that? He, the canon of Reims? We really don't know. But there's no great teacher than experience. Okay. Père Bohin was at one stage de La Salle's spiritual director as a seminarian, and then later when he came back to Paris with his schools, also then, he was a very holy man. And Bohin tells us what the catechism lesson in Sulpice is all about. "We must make an effort to instill in children an extreme horror of sin, a high esteem for the sacraments, and a spirit of great awe." That would be like the sense of fear, but in the sense of fear of the Lord. Great sense of awe, so they'll approach them, the sacraments, rightly disposed. There should not be any satisfaction taken in instructing them, this always means religious instruction, in the things absolutely necessary for salvation. One should do all that one can do to touch their hearts, make them achieve a thorough change, uproot their bad habits, and help them make good confessions. Now, it would be interesting for us to have a look at that for a moment and say, well, wait a minute, what do you notice about the order of things in Père Bohin's analysis? What strikes you?
It starts with fear.
It starts with fear. Okay? Very typical of the time. You're far from salvation. Get them out of sin. Get them... This is very much the spirit of the whole thing. And those of you, who've read various stages and done programs on de La Salle, this comes straight out of the Jansenism of the time. Jansenism, this whole sort of idea that only a few are going to be saved. Like the Calvinist idea, the predetermination. Some are predestined. So you start with fear, an extreme horror of sin, high esteem for the sacraments, which are going to take away sin, spirit of great awe, reverence in church. You're going to find this very strongly in the conduct. Apparently, churches are pretty wild places. When I say wild, I mean there was no great sense of reverence to them. So that they will approach the sacraments rightly disposed. You shouldn't be satisfied with instructing them in the things absolutely necessary for salvation. Absolutely necessary for salvation. Yes, to know these truths. You had to know about God. You had to know about Jesus and the whole message of redemption. You had to know about the coming of the Holy Spirit. You had to know about the Catholic Church, life everlasting, amen. If you knew all those things, you could say the appropriate things in the correct formula, St. Peter would let you in. If you didn't, etc. So the whole catechetical thing was to make sure every boy in that class, every girl in that class could actually say from memory and from understanding, even more importantly, what these things were. Quite a task. Okay. The first thing that's very important is that de La Salle founded a school. He did not found catechetical congregation. He founded something where the catechism would be part of the school day. Indeed, of 6.5 hours in the school day, it would be only 30 minutes. He founded a school within which there was going to be religious instruction, an integral part of it. It was also going to integrate the day because there was going to be the tinkling of the bell in the presence of God. There were going to be prayers said at different times. At the end of the morning school, the children would often be taken off to Mass, particularly at Saint-Sulpice. So there was a lot happening, but it was a school. A great deal of the day was spent doing reading, writing, we'll come to in a moment, elementary arithmetic, manners, learning manners, and learning the French language. Not Latin. Learning to read in Latin, yes, because the prayers are in Latin, but all the teachings being done in French. This is so obvious to us that we forget how revolutionary it was. That nobody taught in French. Nobody taught in French. Nobody taught a class. People were taught individually. They sat in a classroom, but they came up individually for their lessons to be heard. The enormity of what De La Salle and those first brothers did in Reims, we've never really, I think, appreciated. In De La Salle's biographer, Blain, you'll find about 50 pages describing the difficulties they had when they began to teach them as full classes. And most of the 50 pages are just how hard they belted them and how hard the kids reacted to it and how they didn't succeed until eventually they found a way of doing this. Okay, so it was not to be like the Italian congregation founded by César de Bus, a congregation of religious education, of Christian doctrine. Although right through the 18th century, the time of the philosopher, 19th century, we were often referred to as the brothers of the Christian doctrine. Even in official documents, we were never called that. But there was a vague, oh yes, well, they teach religion. It was known that they taught religion. That was part of a school day. And De La Salle writes, the end of this institute is to give a Christian education. Now that's in itself interesting, a Christian education to children. And it is for this purpose that the brothers maintain schools, so that children being under the control of the masters, this is very early writing, they're still being called masters, from morning until night, can teach them to live well by instructing. This is the religious part. By instructing them in the mysteries of our religion. Very important, this word mysteries. And by inspiring them with Christian maxims, the maxims of the gospel. What does it profit a man if he gains the whole world and loses his own soul? Thus giving them not the instruction, but the education they need. Everything in the early Lassallean movement is about needs. What are the needs? How do you answer the needs? So if they go to Calais and open a school, they discover most of the children are the children of fishermen. So you do reading, writing, arithmetic, religion, and you bring in elementary navigation. Because they need it to get back to port. They go to Rouen, the children of merchants. They need something we'd call elementary bookkeeping. Before the French Revolution, the brothers in Marseille are teaching Spanish and Italian. Why? Because these are the children of merchants who are going to be on ships or something and they're going to trade with Italy and with Spain. Needs, etc. Okay, so this is very early. This is the first written version we have, 1705. Now, 1705, they've been going 25 years. So gradually they formulated, this is what it's all about. And this is the beginnings of what becomes a rule, which is finally formulated in 1717. Okay, what do the kids look like? Well, they look like that. So, there was no childhood. There's no childhood till the 18th century. There's no notion of childhood. At 7, the boy becomes a little man. The girl becomes a little woman. And they're expected to work appropriately. It's hard for us to understand that. But what's very important about this is these kids are not dressed, from the later sort of Macy's catalogue or something like that. They're dressed in cut-down clothes that their parents had. That's all. Because there's no childhood. The earliest traces of childhood we find in Europe are actually in the English painter Gainsborough, 18th century. And he's depicting royal children. They look very royal, very well dressed and so on like that. But childhood as such emerges very, very slowly in that sense of children being distinct. Okay, so, yes.
Speaking of children, it was at this time certainly all boys that he was.
Yes, in the initial part, because although there was school for girls, they were instructed in writing, and they were allowed. Indeed, I've seen portraits sometimes where girls are sitting there with their arms folded. This was in Brittany, admittedly sort of away from Paris. The girls are sitting on one side of the classroom with their arms folded, and the boys are sitting at their desks working. The girls were to listen, and that was it. They were not to be instructed. And yet, probably some of the most brilliant women in French history are alive at this time. Madame de Sévigné, for example, in the court of Louis XIV, who spoke and wrote Greek and Latin and all these sorts of things. Those who were educated, yes, but generally little education. The exception would have been with the predecessors of this, what we have in this country, the School Sisters of Notre Dame. The predecessors of those, for example, de La Salle's own sister, Rosette, was a member of that school in Reims. They, in their convent, taught girls to read, taught them needlework, taught them all sorts of things. But this was the exception. And remember, this is still the period when if girls were being instructed, in most cases they went into the convent grounds. Everything, of course, was part of cloister. Ordinary girls, little education at all. So. Okay. What was different about little schools was that all the little schools of the time helped people to learn to read, because they had to take part in church ceremonies, so they learned to read Latin. The point that's made in all the documents of the time, it's easier to read Latin. I'm not sure about that, but they thought it was. Those of you who struggled with French will know that to get the difference between the E acute and the E grave, requires a great deal of work. So, the La Salle schools provided them with reading. And what happened? Because he taught them reading. Those of you know some of the history. What happens when he goes to Paris and teaches reading? They invade his schools. He's taking bread away from those who teach writing. Therefore, they attack his schools, throw the furniture out the window and burn it. And he keeps on doing it. Nowadays, there probably would have been sort of a union dispute over the whole business. Down tools, and he can't do this. He's taking bread away from us. Well, de La Salle's thing, and through Saint-Sulpice and through the sport he did get at different times, had the attitude, it's not just enough to make kids literate, to make them able to read something. They've got to earn their living. They must be able to do something that their parents couldn't do. You've got to move them beyond. In this sense, de La Salle's concept of salvation is very, very important. There's a human sense to salvation. What's he saving them from? If he teaches them writing and reading, what is he saving them from? Poverty, being unemployable. This is the great age of the growth of cities. What do they need in the city? The merchants need people who can read and write. Read and write. That's where the work is. And by putting in the reading and holding on to the opposition, he made them employable. And how interesting that only very recently, a little bit, I'll read this to you, one of your own scholars here in 2009 came across this part, somebody working out of Yale, I expect, judging on where the book's printed from, says this is perhaps why only one congregation, Jean-Baptiste de La Salle's Brothers of the Christian Schools, emerged during our period with a deliberate vocation to run petite école, small schools for boys, a vocation which was exclusive and unusual enough to rule out its members becoming priests. That's the very first word, or one of the first words in the Brothers' Rule. They will not be priests. La Salle's congregation was also unique in accepting that unless the petite école offered something more than religious education, parents would not send their children to school. Hence, its strongly vocational focus. That's Joseph Bergen. Interesting comment. And that's exactly why De La Salle schools succeeded, and why they caused waves, and why they'd upset society, and why that whole friction of the schools being closed down in Paris. And then 18 months go by and the parents demand the schools be brought back, and they open again, etc. It's the way in which the schools get spread throughout France.
Who exactly was throwing the furniture out the windows and burning it?
There would have been the Guild of the Writing Masters. They had this exclusive thing about teaching writing. And they got permission from the Châtelet, the court, that these people were invading their property, doing something which took bread out of their mouths. And De La Salle eventually, there was a condition imposed. Initially, there's a kind of negotiation went on, and they said, listen, if you have in the vestibule of your school the names of all the kids who are completely poor, you can teach them, because they couldn't afford to pay us. So De La Salle should have said, yes, that's all right. But he didn't. Why? Why? And it was humiliating, wasn't it? The kids come into the vestibule of the school each day, and I'm on the list of those who are so poor that I can't pay anything. Oh, we're better than I'm not on that list. Because school was open to everyone. That's what's so fascinating about it. It was open to anybody who wished to come. And we know that some of the people in the early schools, we know this not from the very beginning in Reims, but round about the 1690s in Paris, he's got people who are the children of doctor, for example. Now, doctors were not as wealthy as they are today, or some doctors are today. We have the children of people who actually ran an inn. It's probably owned the inn as well. Now, that's a lot of money for that time. We have children like that. And these are the ones who normally would have gone to the writing master to learn to read. But they came to De La Salle school for two reasons. Well, they didn't pay. That was the first thing, because all the schools were completely gratuitous. But the second thing was, gradually the brothers had got a reputation for teaching writing much better than the writing masters did. And those of you who know something about the conduct of schools, the great teaching book the brothers produced eventually, and the great classic of Western education, know that when the child was old enough to learn to read, to write, the brother stood behind the child and gave him a piece of wood, the same thickness as a pen or a quill. And he said to the child, where does your index finger feel comfortable? And the child said, well, there. He then cut a little groove with his penknife. And where does this finger fit? Okay. Then the child, for a week, simply went like this. Then, when they thought the child had, okay, then they took a real pen. And then they cut the grooves. And that's when the child learned to write. And you find all that detail in the conduct of schools. And the teaching was so good that you read in the conduct that if somebody's been to the school or has been to another school and has learnt to write already, you must say to the parents, we'll give him a 3-month trial. Because if he's been taught to write badly, we can't guarantee that we can reteach him. Isn't that interesting? So that the writing becomes the famous thing the brothers contribute in France. And the style of writing is called in calligraphy le style des frères, the style of the brothers. If you get to the mother house in Rummery estate, you can look at the archives, you will find there examples of penmanship in the great international congresses right through the 19th century, which the brothers always win. When I say always win, the Crystal Palace of 1850, the Vienna Exhibition of 1865, the London Palace 1875, the World's Fair in Chicago, the brothers win all the prizes for calligraphy and so on like that. Becomes their trademark, because they teach them so thoroughly from the very beginning. Okay, so this is an important aspect of what these schools were doing. But it's a school, not just a catechetical society. So what's happening in this kind of school? Well, it's a bit unusual in some ways. So brothers reading to the class? No, not at all. There's a reading lesson going on. He's following the reading. If somebody makes a mistake and says the word badly, he'll have a little clicker, which he clicks, points to the next boy to say the same word that's been mispronounced. If he makes a mistake, he points to the next boy. Then if he doesn't get it right, then he says the word, asks the initial boy to pronounce it again, and the lesson goes on. What's happening over here? They are all learning to read French syllables, because de La Salle doesn't teach them Latin. Yes, they learn to read Latin. He teaches them French. But it's only in 1693 that you get the Academy Dictionary, where French is standardized. Before that, people wrote the way in which people write nowadays, on Facebook and things like that. So those of you who struggle with acute graves and circumflexes, this is where it all starts. Now the language is standardized. So you don't write F-O-R-E-S-S-T-E, you write F-O-R-E circumflex, meaning there's an S in there, T, forêt. It's no longer forest. That's where the language begins. De La Salle writes a little book of 30 pages called a syllabary, and the first thing a child has to do to learn to read and write is the one who knows something gets his little group together and they go through etc. All the different sounds. And only when they can do that, only when they can make all those sounds, do they then get into the actual reading of French. In 1989, the 200 years of the French Revolution, I picked up a book when I was in Paris, in the Boulevard Saint-Germain, and it was a book on the development of the French language. I came across a paragraph that said, probably the greatest single contribution to the production of a uniform French accent before the French Revolution came from the schools of the brothers, who wherever they taught according to the principles of the Academy Dictionary. So you may know that one of the problems in the French Revolution, besides cutting off heads and so on like that, was that all these delegates could not understand one another. They all spoke dialect. But not if you went to the brothers' schools. You spoke French. It's an extraordinary contribution which we've never really done justice to. Anyhow, I don't want to get lost in that. In this school, in this class then, what are they doing down the back here? They're probably practicing writing. These are learning syllables. These are doing reading. And they're sitting on a bench that has 16 kids in it, usually. And the boy who's sitting there came first in reading and the last monthly test. And you know who's sitting next to him? It's the boy who came last. And right down the bench, the ones who did better are there to help the ones who didn't. Isn't that interesting? And every lesson, when arithmetic starts, if he didn't do well in arithmetic, he'd be way down there somewhere. Each lesson is how you went in the last monthly test. Monthly tests? Yes. Therefore, the parents, who possibly could not read and write, were sent details of how their child went at the end of each month. We'd love to know, if they couldn't read or write, what they thought of it. But anyhow, that's how it worked. So this is a pretty different classroom. See, we sometimes talk about the simultaneous method of teaching that De La Salle and his brothers begin, and we think it means teaching the whole class at the same time. No, it's not. It's stage managing. He's the great controller of all those activities going on in the time. He rarely speaks. He rarely speaks. He directs. He points, etc. Up on the walls here are the school regulations. If there's a child who's supposed to be writing or something and is not paying attention, the brother often will simply point to him and then point to the regulation he's not observing. You don't say, "Blogs, what are you doing down there?" No, you don't do that. Just everything's done quietly, efficiently. He speaks only 3 times in the course of a school day. And one of them is the religion lesson. And another one is when he gives his reflection. Otherwise, he speaks only when he has to correct. Okay, let's continue then developing the... What are they teaching? Well, the great mysteries in salvation. The great mysteries are the sort of topic in some ways. And this is one of the great movements of the 17th century, and it refers to what we'd say the great Christian message. It's God in existence. It's the Trinity. It's the incarnation and the redemption. And according to the theology of the time, all those who have reached the age of reason need to learn these and make an explicit act of faith in them to be saved. That's the point. And this goes right across Catholicism, Lutheranism, Calvinism. It goes across the great Reformed religions as well. You must actually know this in order to be saved. And in the whole Calvinist thing and in the whole idea coming up with the Jansenists, there's this idea that only a few get saved. But De La Salle is insistent that God wants everyone to be saved. It's how his great book, Meditation of the Time of Retreat, begins. God wants everyone to be saved and to come to the knowledge of the truth. It's like a trumpet blast against the Jansenists. The moment you pick that up, you know what side De La Salle's on. They're all going to be saved. In particular, we get this work largely through Cardinal Bérulle. And a lot of the emphasis in the 17th century is on Luke's Gospel. We now understand a great deal more about Luke's Gospel. And we know the difficulties we've had since the 1950s, really, when people began to look at and sort of say, but do you mean perhaps, that the stories Luke tells us wasn't exactly like, there weren't really angels? Did the wise men really ride camels? And well, we know a great deal more about the literary form that Luke uses, but these were the great mysteries in particular, and these were the words honoured in a particular way. And in particular, if this was the emphasis, nevertheless, you also come as well to the whole idea of the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus and the whole kenotic element, the way in which Jesus empties himself, became like us in everything. He suffered on the cross, endured even the cross, even to death. This emptying of himself, of the Godhead, as it were, to suffer humanly, the great mystery of that. This is what the great mysteries were about, and this is what salvation was. Remember, salvation as a word comes to us from the Latin word salus, meaning health. What we use nowadays, there's so much writing on this where we don't, the word's lost its sense in some way, but we talk about well-being nowadays. Well-being, that's the sense of salus. Then it gets this spiritual application, sense of being saved from sin, but also being saved for. Saved for what? For eternal life with God. But in De La Salle's mind, not something that happens after you die. Not a question of being saved only when It's a question of being saved so that you live on this life with dignity. That's the sense of salvation he has. Salvation from the street, from unemployment, from all those things. Salvation for what? For eternal life with God, for happiness in this life, etc., for the ability to live with dignity, etc. That's salvation. Okay. Watching my time, so I'll just sort of... Now, when we talk about mysteries, sometimes the word itself bothers us. Those of you who have gone through biblical studies and looked at the word mysterion in Greek will know exactly what the problem is in some way. But sometimes unconsciously when we heard, the mystery, yes, we think about things, it's a puzzle or a problem. There's an answer to it somewhere. No, it's rather what de La Salle will tell us to do is we enter into the mystery. We put ourselves inside the mystery. We're with Mary at the Annunciation. We try and think, did she understand what was being offered? And yet she said yes to it. At Christmas time, when we commemorate all these marvellous things, I often think about this as we're standing sort of in, probably 105 degrees, sort of on Christmas Day or Christmas Eve in Australia, singing "See Amid the Winter Snows." I sometimes think there's something wrong here, but anyhow, but somehow, yes, we do try and place ourselves. We do sing Christmas carols. We do try and make that thing happen again for us. We enter into the mystery. And I think that's a very, very beautiful concept. Same as we do at Holy Week and on Good Friday. The symbolic things, do the washing of the feet, the standing at the cross, the whole idea of Pentecost and so on like that. So that's what the mysteries are about. Not some kind of code that takes you into, so you become a second-degree Mason or something. No, you're entering into these mysteries, this way in which God has revealed himself through these great events and which we are part of, because all things were done for us. Jesus' redemption was for us. That very, very deep sense in which we live our faith, our liturgy, through these mysteries in the course of a school year, of a sort of a church year. So, The Conduct of Schools is the book that the brothers write in 1705, 1706. De La Salle calls together, it says, the oldest and the most experienced teachers. We hope the two things they possibly go together anyway. We're never quite sure whether the end is cumulative or anyhow. And he says to them, all right, imagine we're going to start all over again. How would you run? Because the word conduct in French is a very elusive 17th century word called conduite, which means something more like guidance, much closer to guidance than management. So he says to them, how would you actually, if you're starting all over, how would you run or set up a Christian school? And they spend nearly 10 weeks and they write a manuscript, but they don't finish it. So in 1706 he calls the same group back and they finish the manuscript. Then he says they make copies and send it to all the schools and say, try this out. And then 10 years later, 1717, he says to them, send in now the things you'd want to see changed. And they send them in. And before his death, he prepares a final version. This becomes, in 1720, the first printed version of the management of schools, or the La Conduite des Écoles Chrétiennes in French. Now, what's interesting about this is the catechism is taught every day for half an hour, from 4 o'clock to 4:30. It's the last lesson of the afternoon. And there are particular ways which should be carried out, which feasts are to be observed. Because the school day, the holiday is Thursday, not Saturday. They go through Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and that's tied up with the market. This is when the market day, and sort of when children are sometimes needed because the parents have a stall and so on. Then they go to school all day Friday, all day Saturday. So that's an important part of the understanding what the thing was. And before the Thursday, the lesson would last longer. And similarly, of course, they taught on Sunday. They taught on Sunday, not in the church, they taught in the school. The kids came to the school on Sunday, sat in the familiar benches, and they learnt their lesson there. Now, fascinating, the catechism lesson was always at the end of the day. Some of you may think, my goodness me, Friday afternoon, wow, end of the day. Well, everything else was cleared off the desk, and it was a question and answer session. No reading, no writing, everything was oral, everything. Perhaps this group against that group, and the questions were asked again and again and again, etc. And this went on, examination of conscience, and then class, there was the prayers of the afternoon, a hymn was sung, it says never more than 6 verses, okay. And the idea was the pupils then all fed up, you've been singing, so on, you bounce out of school, you go home and you share the good news with your parents. You may be at home or may not be. That was the theory. That's what they did. Whether it happened or not, we don't know. But that's what they thought was the best time to teach it. And there are all sorts of arguments about that you could bring. But the argument is very simple. When the kid comes to school, they're usually hungry. The day's disasters are still in front of them. Whereas at this stage of the afternoon, everything's over. There's nothing to be worried about now. There's just the half hour before you go. And therefore, this active lesson with everybody involved and so on like that, and the hymn is sung, and they go home and take the good news back to their parents. So, this wasn't so great in quantity, I point out, but it was 30 school minutes in a day of 6.5 hours. But it took place every day. You taught religion every day. Every day. And so, over the week and so on like that, you're getting 3.5, 4.5 hours of actual instruction, if you count in the Sunday. And then you had the special ones, the ordinary half hour, but before holidays and feast days, you had a full hour. And these longer lessons were always about the mysteries. This is where you went back again to the important formulation of the great mysteries, and you made sure that they understood exactly what this mystery was. And how did you do this? By questioning, and by questioning every pupil 6 or 7 times if necessary. How they did it in a class of 60 or 100 we never worked out, but still that's the theory. And in such a way that the level of teaching was not that of the highest kid, the kid who could answer everything backwards, but that of the lowest. Everybody had to know this. And so you had encouraging ways of the poor child who was struggling to make an answer. You'd say, well, who made the world? Well, God made the world. So who is God? Well, God's a creator. Do you know what a creator is? Well, he makes things. Is a carpenter a creator? Well, I don't know, brother. What do you think? In other words, all the time you're looking for meaning, meaning, meaning. And only when they understand it in their words do you say, okay, how would you say that? What does the catechism book say about this? Because they've all learnt these things off. And they'll say, oh, God is the creator of heaven and earth and of all things created. Okay. But you get to it each time by making sure everybody knows what those words are. And this is the whole point of the longer lesson. This is fascinating. How do you ask questions, the conduct of school says? He will not speak to the pupils during catechism as though he were preaching. Isn't this important? He's not talking down to them. He's working with them. So important. He's not sermonizing. I'm still staggering from the fact that the Holy Name Cathedral on Sunday in Chicago, some of you might remember those wonderful readings we had last Sunday about the vineyard. Beautifully read the first Isaiah reading, then the reading from Paul, then the beautiful gospel reading. The sermon was on, I'm not quite sure. But the readings were never mentioned. I kept on wondering, why do they have the readings? That's a fill-in, is it, for the really big act now coming up? Anyhow, that's... So this, the teacher's not to do that. But he asked them questions and sub-questions. The example I just gave. Creator. Oh, are carpenters creators? That's the sub-question. No. Well, why aren't carpenters? They make something, don't they? Yes, but they make it out of wood. Oh. So a creator something and makes things... So you see what I mean? You get to the depth of the meaning all the time. Questioning, sub-questions, etc. He will ask several pupils, one after another, the same question. Sometimes he'll ask it of 7 or 8 or even 10 or 12, and sometimes even of a greater number, to make sure that the point goes in. And this side of the class, did you hear what they said over here? What do you think? Play off one against the other and so on like that. All those things you all had in grade school. There are important pedagogical reasons why the brothers taught always in the classroom. Even on Sundays, the kids came to the school, and from the school they were taken to the Vespers, or whatever the ceremony was, in the afternoon. The lesson lasted an hour and a half on Sundays. It was about the feast days. Pupils were in familiar surroundings. They had set places. They were always seated in a certain order instead of being on the church benches. They were called by name. Interesting that in the brothers' schools, the children were called by their first name. What do you think, Jean-Pierre? What do you think, Paul? Etc. like that. But those of you who know French, if the child was not paying attention, you would say to him, Qu'est-ce que vous faites? Instead of using the familiar form of address, tu, which you in families, thou, we've lost all this in English. So you're saying Pierre, Jean-Paul, etc. Qu'est-ce que vous faites? The moment you come to the vous, this is now very formal. Kid sits back because he's no longer being addressed, he's now being addressed, etc. All those subtleties, because it's about relationship. It's about relationship. These people said they're going to be brothers to one another and older brothers to the young people. So the older brother calls his younger brother by name, by his baptismal name. If he's not behaving, then he says, oh, qu'est-ce que vous faites? Oh, little jolt. Oh, okay, next time you call him tu, or by his name. Very subtle, but very important. Their attendance is more easily controlled. How you controlled attendance in those 12 centres in Saint Sulpice that de La Salle would have had to contend with as a young, seminarian, I don't know. They had the possibility of writing if need be. They were not exposed, as would have been the case in church, to the presence of adults and strangers who were present but not taking part in the lesson. Because everybody had to attend the catechism lesson on Sunday afternoons, particularly in parishes in the countryside. And they were ticked off, their names had to be there. You think, oh, this was strange. My Catholic ancestors came from the Isle of Skye. And in 1829, having been fined Monday after Monday for not being present in the Protestant church, they decided, this is it. They got on a boat and came to Australia, never to go back. It wasn't just peculiar to the Catholic Church. All the churches, very strongly in the whole Puritan tradition here, wasn't it also? People were expected to be in church on Sunday and in the various churches. And if they weren't there, then there was a kind of please explain. Expect you there next time. Were you really sick? And this applied not only to the family, but also to domestics. So on. Okay, so that's why the church was so important. I have something very particular about this, which you'll find in your texts here, which have been so wonderfully prepared. So you get everything that's being done here, you'll get a text and a footnote for and so on like that. So, we find that what happens in de La Salle schools take on many of the emphases that begin with the method of Saint Sulpice, which was regarded right throughout history as one of the great catechetical methods. But they take the bones of it, but they develop it in all sorts of interesting ways. In de La Salle schools, you couldn't stay in the school unless you actually attended the catechism lesson, not only during the week, but on Sundays and feasts. This was the thing. You couldn't get the reading, writing, arithmetic and everything else without also being part of the catechism. That was sort of part of the bargain. I think it probably helped also that this school-based catechism set the work of the whole Christian school. The whole day was a day of faith. The bell rang, the presence of God was recalled. If the funeral bell tolled, the teacher stopped teaching immediately and the class was asked to pray for the person for whom the funeral bell was being tolled. There was that sense of faith, of sharing faith, of praying that went through the whole day. So there was an atmosphere of prayer, an atmosphere of faith. And in that sense, it was a very, very much part of that whole relationship, the brotherly relationship between the brother and his pupils. Because what de La Salle aims at doing, and we find this again and again in his writings, was to form true disciples of Jesus Christ. That's what the aim of this Christian school was. Did they succeed with everybody? We don't know. Were the figures as bad as Dennis told us this morning? Possibly. We don't know. But we know that that was the atmosphere in which everything was taught. You see, if you know Les Miserables, I'm sure you realize that poor Jean Valjean spent quite of his time at some stage in a prison. And who lived in the prison and taught in the prison? The brothers. We find that in the French edition. The English edition says he was taught by a group of monks. That's not true. It was we had a school there in Toulouse. It was in the prison. We taught prisoners, which we did very strongly through the 1840s and so on in France. So I just instance this because this is a very, very important aspect of the heritage, that the religion permeated the day, but it was a day that had multiple activities in it, and they were basically about reading, writing, arithmetic, etc., religion, politeness, speaking the language properly. All of those things were part of the school. There was no separation. Well, now here's the holy bit and here's the ordinary bit. It was all one part. It was one thing. In fact, it's incredible the more you look at de La Salle in that light. He has no distinction between sacred and secular. These things are part of the whole day. It's God's world. The incarnation has taken place. It's in that world that we live and move and so on like that. Okay, that's the heritage. That's where it all starts from. It's grade school. It's big classes. We know that they aimed at having, if possible, only as many as 60. But we know that in the school of Rue Princesse near Saint-Sulpice in Paris, we know that there were 4 classes and there were over 400 students, 400 pupils. One can only speculate. And because it's the one place in Paris where you can actually still see the site of the school, it's not a school any longer, it's just a residential thing, but when you're allowed round the back and look at the stairway, it's a wooden staircase. And it's all worn down on the inside. If you look at it, the part nearest the banister, it's about like that. From those hundreds of kids going up and down it all those years that the brothers ran the school there. It's an interesting little... Anyhow. Questions, comments, observations? Yes?
In one class, would there be one brother or one woman?
Always one brother.
Only one?
Yes, except when the young brother was doing his apprenticeship. The young brother had to, for 3 years, for example, the young brother was never allowed to punish in any way. Not that they punished greatly, but they had this little stick and so on like that. But he couldn't do that. He'd been teaching 3 years, which I think is very significant. Because you don't earn your stripes by being able to bash kids. You have to learn to teach them. And the task of the director was to come into the class periodically and see how things were going. Yes?
You talked about all this questioning during the catechism. Is there any connection or understanding of this Socratic method? It sounds like a Socratic method. So is there any insight or knowledge that he studied and looked at the Greek Socrates to develop this style?
It's somehow part and parcel of the, as I point out in the text somewhere, It's important to look at, if you look at the word catechism as it comes up in Latin, catechismus and catechisme and all the other different languages and so on like that, that in 1900, for example, if you look at the Oxford Dictionary of 1900 and look at the word catechism, you can see there's a catechism of geology, there's a catechism of imperial measurement, there's a catechism of biology. There are whole sorts of catechisms. So what was the task of the catechism? To put this in a succinct form to be learnt off by heart. Okay? That was the sense of catechism. And if you go back to the original katechein in the Greek, the whole idea was, if you go back, it was children singing out in chorus the answers to questions posed by the teacher. Have you ever seen any of those pictures of children in a madrasas learning the Quran? What they learn is they say it over and over again all day long, it's not even as long as the New Testament, it's just engraved on the memory. Whether it's understood or not, it's another thing. That's why the emphasis always in the conduct is you never ask the children to learn anything until you're convinced that they know what the words mean. And how do you know what the words mean? You ask them questions. You ask them questions all the time, etc. You get them thinking about things. Okay. Yes.
I'm struggling with how you started when you talked about the motivation of fear, which is effective, but it's also very shaming. And when we move to the way that De La Salle approached it with motivation of meeting a real need,
Yes.
it's more of a relationship and a loving aspect.
Yes.
And you contrast that with our kids today and how Brother Visitor talked about where kids are going today.
Yes.
I'd be curious to know if Dr. De La Salle were here today, what would he say is the needs then of these children that are leaving?
Today, yes. Well, I won't answer it straight off, but that's exactly what, in some ways, the whole three presentations are about. You know, what is it? How do you actually, particularly faith speaking to faith? I think those you are recalling, as Ernest did for us yesterday, Tom Green's whole thing. Yes, it is faith speaking to faith, but it's also, as you know yourself, particularly you teach around year 11 and 12, or perhaps 10, 11 and 12, or 9, 10, 11 and 12, sometimes it's faith speaking to doubt, or faith speaking to non-faith, etc. And I think behind all this, Tom, we've got to distinguish the great thing about the French catechetical movement of the post-war periods, which ran into difficulties with Rome, naturally, almost by definition, just as the worker priest movement did, etc., is that when they finally come to formulate, well, what are we doing? It's no longer teaching catechism. What is it? And the French expression is l'éducation de la foi, the education of faith. But you see, in the French, you can say l'éducation de la foi, education of the faith we all share, we believe, but the education of faith also in a personal sense. And the two senses are very important and complementary, aren't they? It's the education, we would like to think it's the education of the faith of this individual, but it's the education of this individual's faith into the faith of the church as well. Both senses are very important to retain. So that if the child has learnt off the catechism, the year after I didn't get the prize for Christian doctrine, by the way, it was the Jewish boy in my class who beat me. He did better answers than I did. The faith? He knew the faith apparently better than I did. What was his personal faith? Well, he was practicing Jew. So the two things have to be kept in a nice little tension while we're going through all these things. I'll just make one last comment because you've got all this in your text and footnoted and so on like that. But it was interesting on this whole question of the great mysteries. De La Salle has a party which you'll read, profession of the 10 articles of faith, that a Christian is obliged to believe and to know. I believe there's only one God and there cannot be several gods. Agreed? Amen. Right. I believe that three persons in God, etc. I believe that the Son of God, okay. Then it goes on, etc. It never mentions the resurrection. Fascinating, isn't it? Never mentions the resurrection. They've got to be saved. They've got to know about God and the truths of God, otherwise they can't be saved. It's almost as though he formulates this elsewhere, but this happens to be a particular part of his writing, where he says these are 10 things they have to know. But the resurrection doesn't come into it. That would be fairly typical of the preaching and the emphasis of the time. Much more about fear of the Lord than love of God. Although we find De La Salle writing about the love of God. Ernest.
Perhaps an observation is to piggyback off of Holly, and perhaps something for us to continue to think about as we move through our time together, and particularly looking forward to tomorrow's morning's presentation about today. But can it be the case that to some degree we, in our classroom sometimes, we're not willing to ourselves and with our students wrestle with doubt, right? As Thomas Groom puts it, it's faith to life, life to faith, and doesn't life include doubt?
Good. Of course. I mean, the quotation today you had from Simone de Weil, the way in which she comes to faith as a Jewish is the questioning of her own faith in an extraordinary kind of way that takes her eventually to Christian faith by doubting and saying no, etc. That in itself is interesting. Yes, so that will come up also, really as we do the second version, ways of showing faith and so on. Well, I'm trying to be faithful. It's 22 and we have a break, I think, till 11.